Howdy guys, we're back with the Land Talk Podcast for episode 3. I've got Justin with me. Justin, give us your background here.
Sure. So I've been in the land business for close to 20 years. Started off as a field surveyor and worked in that capacity running survey crews for almost 10 years. And then moved into the office where I started running all the field operations, processing data, building deeds, drafting, and the like. And got my real estate license back in 2008 or 9, and have been helping folks with farm and ranch real estate ever since, and dealing with a lot of issues that most ordinary agents that sell houses in subdivisions don't really know as much about because of my experience with the survey.
Right. And working for us at Texas Direct Land, what counties do you generally cover?
So my counties are generally going to be Comal, Hayes, Bastrop, Caldwell, Blanco, and I serve the great state of Texas. So
Sure.
If you got to go out to El Paso, I can do that too, but generally my bread and butter is those first counties I listed. So.
Right. No, that's great. So getting into access a little bit. So when you own a property or you're going to buy a property, you've got to have some way to get to it, right? And by vehicle, you generally. But what kind of different access types do you see when you're looking at a property?
Well, that's a great question. So there's several. The first and best access type is going to be fee simple access to a public right-of-way, which means the property you own touches the public right-of-way. But just remember, just because it touches a public right-of-way doesn't necessarily mean you have access into the property. For example, TxDOT on a TxDOT highway may not issue a driveway permit, even though your property actually touches the public right-of-way. So there's fee-simple access. There's access by easement, either deeded or prescriptive easement. And we kind of covered easements in the last podcast we did. But the best way, if you're going to have an easement, is to have a deeded easement that's written and recorded. And that way, as the properties get sold time and time again, that easement is going to run with the property, and you know that you have access back to it.
Right. So the best ones are written. They're going to be what we call in the business express, right? They're going to be
Correct.
laid out. They're going to be written on paper and signed. We can get into some implied easements, which means you have the implied right to access your property. But being that those are implied, they're not expressed. They're not as good. And we kind of touched on the last issue, but verbally, you can access your property too. If you have a verbal agreement, that will give you a way to access your property. However, it could be short-lived. Things on properties change, owners change, people pass away, new people come in. Over time, you may not get along with that person who gave you that verbal agreement. They may have forgotten what they said. So obviously, getting into writing is always the best practice. But as far as accomplishing your goal of access to property, verbal works. It's just not gonna help you in the long run, right?
That's right. And as I mentioned in the last episode, I see more lawsuits over easements and access easements in particular than pretty much anything land related, including boundary disputes. Everybody thinks boundary disputes is such a huge deal, and it is, but it's not as big a deal as how do you get from the roadway, the public right of way, to your property.
Right. So in our business today, we have a lot of folks buying land. Many of those folks are getting loans on their property, right? So what are some typical things you see that a lender is going to require as far as satisfying their need to do underwriting?
Sure. So a bank is not going to lend money on a property that doesn't have access.
Right. So if it's landlocked, you probably
if it's landlocked, yeah, you're not going to get a loan. If you do have access, the access has to not only satisfy the lender's requirements, but it's also going to have to satisfy the county or the municipality's requirements as far as width and how that easement is maintained to get back to the property. So, the bank is generally going to default back to the county's requirements. If you need at least 30-foot wide access to a property, that's what the bank is going to want. in order to lend money on that property.
Right, but I guess a municipality or a county could come in and say 30 foot's not sufficient, and maybe we need more.
They could say it's not sufficient, or the property could have been deeded 100 years ago, and the easement isn't 30 foot or isn't 50 foot or whatever the new regulation is, but it's going to be grandfathered in. So it doesn't mean that property can't be sold, but it just has access that down the road you most likely probably would not ever be able to develop that property if you wanted to, because the access is not large enough. And then also, if you're buying a property for future development, you want to make sure you understand that a lot of times when you plat down the road to develop that property, an easement is not going to suffice for access on a new development. You're going to have to go to the landowner that the easement crosses and buy a strip of land large enough and then improve that land to the county's satisfaction.
Right. So kind of jumping back into widths, and specifically on, let's talk about easements, because I think that's where it comes in most play. But I think it's kind of interesting to see how widths have changed over time, because even I've only been doing this for a little over 10 years now, but the widths have changed. So a lot of the lenders early on, a 20-foot easement was fine, and then it moved to 30 foot, and now you're seeing a lot of 50s and 60s. You can see 100 foot. So, and this is not only for, it doesn't have to be for easements. This could be for the strips of what we call flagpoles, which is a deeded strip to get to your property. But what do you think? Why do you think the widths have changed on that? I kind of have some ideas. What do you think?
So nobody has a crystal ball about what's going to happen in the future, right? But it's the municipalities looking forward, because so much land in the past was cut up without proper access, and if it did have access, it was poor. And now the counties are having to rectify all of the problems from the past with these access issues. And so they don't want that to happen in the future. And so, right now, maybe 100 acres of farmland that's being sold with, an access easement. But one day, that could be an apartment complex. So you need to have enough width for a future dedicated right-of-way. 60 feet comes to mind. And that's going to have to be wide enough for emergency vehicles to go down. And then eventually there has to be a way out as well if you're not going to have a cul-de-sac at the end. So there's a lot of things to think about. So it's not just what the property is being used for now, it's what the property could be used for 20 years from now.
Right. And I think looking back in time, you can find some older easements, and not only do they mention access by vehicle, but they mention access by walking, access by horse-drawn wagon, or access by horse. So I think it's kind of interesting to see how the old ones were treating it, because obviously those are the normal ways to get to a property. But I think in my mind, the biggest thing that have changed is what we're bringing into properties now. So if you look now, a lot of folks are bringing in mobile homes. Mobile homes are really wide. If you have a 20-foot easement, there may not be enough room to get it in there. And a big equipment, so big bulldozers. If you have a 15 or 20-foot wide easement, that easement, let's get into this a little bit. So that easement has a boundary on, let's argue the left and right side to make it simple. But that line goes from the center of the earth all the way into the sky. So do I have the right to cross over that line above the ground? So
that's a good point, and I'll tell you a story about property I surveyed a couple of years ago. There was access to the property, deeded access through an easement. It's great. It was only 10 foot wide because the easement was created in 1850, 1860, when you're either going to walk it or you're going to have a horse and a wagon, and you could get down it that way. Well, the owner of the property where the easement was crossing did not like that easement. He did not want that easement to be there. He couldn't get rid of it, but he sure as heck could put a barbed wire fence right at the edge of each side of that 10-foot easement, and you could barely drive a pickup truck down there, and then where it would turn at a 90-degree angle, you could not turn it, let alone pull a horse trailer or anything else down there. So it effectively made that property not accessible. So the owner was going to have to try and get another easement, not from the guy where the current easement came, probably from another surrounding landowner, and that not going to be easy and could be expensive.
Yeah. But I've seen a lot of times, like the thought of if you're carrying a bulldozer into a property and the bulldozer has a big wide blade and that blade's going over your 15-footer, legally you're trespassing if you're crossing from the boundary of that.
Yeah, a lot of times no one's going to say anything.
Most of it
but if you had somebody who had a real problem with it, they could.
And this is way off subject, but it kind of gets into a lot of the hunting issues with corner crossing. Have you seen that stuff like in western states of are you trespassing when you're crossing? And I think legally you are. I think it's really dumb, but legally the definition of that is you're trespassing if you're crossing over the plane of that line. Yeah. And like to your point, most people don't care. It's not a big deal. But that's kind of the point of why these things are getting wider and wider. Like I said, I think you're getting bigger equipment. You're getting mobile homes. And then kind of moving further down to your point, one day that thing may be a county road or
and then you got to just leave it to the lawyers to sort that kind of stuff out. So
yeah. So as far as road ownership, have you run into anything on that as far as a property line versus ownership line as it equates to access?
Sure. So are you talking about right-of-ways that appear to be public right-of-ways, but property actually goes to the center line?
Right, that would be an example. And then I was thinking about how sometimes your property extends into a public road.
Yeah. So a lot of times back in the hill country, they would take a skid steer and they'd just push a road through the trees, and kind of where that road went, that's where it went. And at the time, the properties came together and they shared property lines, and then they dedicated X number of feet on each side of that line as an easement. Well, now, to rectify that, when property is being replatted in those areas or further developed, the county is taking that back, and the right of way is moving. You're losing some of the acreage of that land.
Yeah, so here in Mon County, where I do most of my business, and growing up here for that matter, but the county owns little to no roads. I mean, I can only think of a handful that they may own. I'm going to say 90% of the county roads here are owned by a private party. And typically what we're going to see is the boundary line on a property is either going to go to the middle of the road, because at one point that was a shared fence line. To your point, they kind of bulldoze the road right down the middle. But I've run into some problems to where, let's say instead of following a joint line where the line's in the middle, let's say the property line is actually on one side of the road or the other. So in that sense, one owner may own the entire road, which I own a property where I have that problem now. I own the entire road all the way across to the ditch on the other side. And then kind of on the flip side of that coin, the guy across the road doesn't own any of the road. So I actually had a scenario some years back to where there was an old private road that later became public, and it's kind of a complicated story, but there's some landowners making some issues about how they own the entire road, and because they owned it all, I had no right to use it. So you get some kind of silly instances of that. And obviously what came into play there was that the county maintains the road, and being that I'm a taxpayer, I get to use any road the county maintains. So that was kind of the thing that settled that problem. But we get a lot of landowners and buyers that number one, they may forget that they own in the middle of the road, or you have a new buyer coming in and they kind of don't factor that in. So you'll see a lot of our surveys, and it's going to say a property is 50 acres, and then in parentheses it's going to say with 1.5 acres inside a county road. And that's just something to kind of note, that you may be paying for land, and maybe you're paying by the acre, and some of that land is going to be land that you own, and you have title to it, and you're paying taxes on it, but it's inside that road. And I think that's kind of frustrating, because a lot of folks, they're saying, man, that's mine, but I can't use it, and I've got to pay, let's say it's an acre and a half. They may be paying $20,000 or $30,000 for that acre and a half in a public road. It's kind of frustrating. So I think that's kind of something that we have to explain a lot of times. It kind of falls through the cracks here. And every county's different. There's a lot of counties where the county actually owns the road and you don't run into that. But that's a problem we run into in our county, just because, the county doesn't own the road. So it's just kind of something I think we need to bring up to buyers, that you may be buying some ownership in a road that you own, but it's in the road. So, but I know we've had some times where a buyer doesn't want to pay for that section in the road. Have you run into that before?
Yeah, I've run into that, and a lot of times it's just kind of tough luck from the seller. And as far as the seller maintaining that land in the apparent right-of-way, I don't really think that's a great idea. That is, for all intents and purposes, a public road, right. And they would just be paying taxes on something they couldn't really use.
Right, but have you run into previous landowners trying to stop access?
I've had people talk about it, but they're not successful.
What about like strips of land?
So you're probably talking about spite strips, and I've run into that on several occasions. And for those at home that don't know what a spite strip is, let's say you have a property and it runs what looks to be all the way to a public right-of-way. Well, the previous owner could have maintained a 6-inch strip of land there and cut that property off from the roadway out of spite. Spite strip. And that could be done for a number of reasons. One, they never want that property to be developed, and so no one can access it legally. And two, they could have done it because, well, really, that's the main reason. Actually, they don't want, just out of spite. They just don't like the person.
So would that show up on a survey? And I have a reason for asking that. Obviously, I guess there should be a deed from them keeping that. But I've run into some instances on surveys before to where the distances between 2 points are so small that the scale of the survey can't cover 6 inches, right? So I'm sure it would show up there. I mean, would y'all just note lack of access, or what would you see there?
So a lot of times on surveys, not a lot of times, all the time on surveys we produce, we have a certification that says this property has apparent access to a public right-of-way. Now, if we come across a spite strip and it's 6 inches, we would most likely do blow-ups of each pin and show a rod and maybe a calculated point or 2 rods in that 6-inch area and show that strip and call it out if it was there. And we definitely would not say that it has access to a public right-of-way.
Right, but it seems like y'all are pretty clear on saying generally it has apparent access just because of going back to earlier that you don't know the rules that TxDOT or some other entity of the road may have.
Exactly.
So it's always going to be apparent. Now, what about, so that talks about if it's covered in a survey, but what about in title? What do you typically see as far as guaranteeing access within a title policy? What do they usually note there?
So a lot of times they'll say, this X number of acre tract along with said easement to get to the tract. Now, there's a couple different ways that can go. It can be listed as 2 separate tracts. One is the main tract and one is the easement. In that case, the lender may require a survey of the actual easement, which would be an additional fee, and you'd have to go and tie in the boundary corners of every property that easement goes through and then locate where that easement is based on a description.
Gotcha.
But most of the time, you're going to assume it has access through an easement, and it's not going to be required by the title company to survey out that entire easement.
Yeah, and I think typically if your property doesn't, let's say the title company's looking for an easement for access. Most of the time, if they don't find an instrument that gives you access, they're going to accept for it in Schedule B.
Exactly.
And it's going to say lack of access to and from the property.
One of the many, many things that title companies accept to in Schedule B.
And that's one of their favorite things to do for sure. What about, I was thinking about this a minute ago. So let's say you do have, and I know we kind of covered easements in the last episode, but let's say you have an easement access to your property right now. Could you kind of have what's called a dominant estate, right? So then you can kind of get into that. So what does, can a landowner block me from using that easement? I mean, as far as the person who owns the property you're going through, could they put a building in my way or?
Okay, so generally, if there's an easement there, you cannot construct anything permanent within that easement.
Right.
Also, in the easement, in the recorded easement, it's going to tell you how long that easement runs, and most of the time, it's going to run in perpetuity for all heirs and assigns, for people that when you transfer that easement. Right. Sometimes it will stop and say, well, if it's ever sold outside of our family, then this easement goes away, and that can become a problem.
Right, and then you run into gates. I mean, a lot of people think, oh, well, nobody can put a gate and lock it on my easement, and I think to a certain extent that's true. But
they got to give you a combination.
Yeah,
you got to be able to access through it.
And what's cool, you see it a lot in Texas, which is kind of different from other places. But we get in like the kind of joint locks where you may have 10 or 15 locks on one easement. So that's kind of an intricate thing there. But I guess to sum it all up, if you have an easement through a property, that easement gives you dominant use. It's your use of that easement supersedes their use of it. So I know there's an episode on Yellowstone I remember watching where the guy put like 50 cattle guards along this easement to try to stop him from being able to use it effectively. and that's the point of getting an easement, is to stop stuff like that to where nobody can come in and block you from your property in any way, shape, or form. So I think that's why it's important to always get an easement in writing that kind of outlines everything. But kind of going back,
if you don't like it, take it to court.
That's it.
See what happens.
So we talked earlier about what a lender requires as far as access. We know they need to be able to get to a property in case you have to repossess it. But what if you're paying cash? Kind of what's required then on access?
Sure. So with cash deals, obviously there's a lot fewer requirements, not only for surveys and the like, but also for access. Now, would I recommend you buying a property without legal access? No, I would not. But could you? Yeah.
Yeah, you could do it.
You can buy a property that's not even a legal tract.
Yeah, you can buy a property
that later.
Yeah, you can buy a property that may not be owned by the person you're buying it from.
Yeah.
Right? You can get quick claim deeds and all kinds of stuff. So,
That's right.
yeah, cash is really good. I think it's a good way to transact business, but sometimes it's negatives because you can run into problems that you didn't look for.
For those who don't know any better, you can run into a lot of problems by going through cash.
Yeah. But I think by and large, I think to sum everything up, it's super important to have legal access. I think it's something that you should do a lot of research on. And I think you should, to your point, you should kind of really lean on a surveyor and a title company to make sure you have a legal instrument to get to and from your property. And I think when in doubt, consult an attorney. That's what we tell everybody. There's a lot of things that as brokers and agents we can help on, but an attorney's invaluable as far as their understanding of the law. So do you have any more notes along that line there?
No, that sounds
okay.
Sounds bad.
Well, that's Land Talk episode 3, talking about access to and from your property. I'm John Dean, the broker here. I got Justin here helping me, but we'll catch you on episode 4.